A car dealership manager mocked and kicked out a man, thinking he was just another broke customer. What he didn't know? The man was about to become his boss. The sun glared against the polished glass windows of the luxury car dealership, reflecting the pristine rows of high-end vehicles parked outside. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with a sense of exclusivity. Sleek suits, leather interiors, and the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee meant only for serious buyers. The showroom was a place of status, where people were judged at first glance, and appearances dictated respect. A man stepped through the entrance, his presence drawing little to no attention. He was dressed simply: black jeans, a fitted t-shirt, and a worn leather jacket. He walked with quiet confidence, his eyes scanning the showroom, but to the salesman watching from a distance, he was just another window shopper, someone wasting their time. From behind the front desk, an older salesman leaned toward the dealership's manager, lowering his voice. "Should I handle him, or is he one of those customers?" The manager barely spared a glance before shaking his head. "Let him look. He won't be here long." The man wandered deeper into the dealership, his fingers brushing lightly against the hood of a sleek black Porsche. He inspected the car closely, running his hand along its curves as if appraising its true value. Something about the way he looked at it, like he knew more than just the brand name, made one of the younger salesmen pause. "Excuse me, sir," the salesman said hesitantly, stepping forward. "Are you looking for something specific?" The man turned, meeting his gaze with a knowing smile. "Yes, I'd like to test drive this one." His voice was even, polite, but there was a quiet authority beneath it. Before the salesman could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Don't waste your time." The dealership's manager stepped forward, his suit perfectly pressed, his expression dripping with condescension. He was a man who had built his authority on assumptions, who to impress, who to dismiss. And right now, he had decided this man wasn't worth a second more of his attention. "This car isn't something you just sit in for fun," the manager continued, his lips curling into a smirk. "People come here knowing what they can afford. You don't look like you're in the market for a Porsche." A silence settled between them, the kind that made an entire room take notice. Some of the salesmen exchanged quiet glances, amused but unsurprised. Customers with deep pockets usually flaunted their wealth, the designer watches, the tailored suits. This man had none of that. The man let the words hang in the air before tilting his head slightly. "And what do I look like I can afford?" The manager chuckled, as if this was all a joke to him. "I don't know. Maybe something more reasonable." His tone dripped with thinly veiled disdain, his eyes flickering toward the used car section in the far corner of the lot. The younger salesman who had first approached the man shifted uncomfortably, sensing something was off. There was an ease in the way this man carried himself, something that didn't fit the image the manager had painted of him. "If you don't mind," the man said, his voice still calm, still measured, "I'd like to speak to the person in charge." The manager let out a laugh, shaking his head. "That would be me." For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable passed across the man's face. He gave a slow nod, as if confirming something to himself, then stepped back. "All right," he said. "Let's see how this plays out." And with that, he turned away, leaving behind an air of quiet finality, one that the manager, in all his arrogance, failed to recognize as the beginning of his downfall. The manager watched the man turn away, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Just another time waster, another nobody trying to act important. He had seen it before. People walking in, touching the cars, dreaming of a life they could never afford. He prided himself on knowing exactly who was worth his time. And this man, he was nothing more than a distraction. "Hey," the manager called out, his voice carrying across the showroom. "I don't think you heard me. We don't do test drives for people who aren't serious buyers. So why don't you stop wasting my staff's time?" A few customers turned their heads, their curiosity piqued. The younger salesman hesitated, looking between the manager and the man, sensing the growing tension. The man, however, didn't stop. He continued walking, his stride unhurried, as if the words hadn't reached him. That irritated the manager. He stepped forward, louder this time. "Are you deaf or just slow?" That made the room pause. The man finally stopped in his tracks. His shoulders squared, but he didn't turn around immediately. There was a shift in the atmosphere, an invisible weight pressing down on everyone who had just witnessed what happened. Some of the employees glanced at each other, unsure if this had gone too far, but none of them spoke up. Slowly, the man pivoted on his heel, locking eyes with the manager. His face was unreadable, his expression eerily calm. "What did you just say?" His voice was steady, controlled, but beneath the surface, something sharp lingered. The manager folded his arms, his smirk widening. "I said, you're wasting my time. We have real customers here, people who actually belong in a place like this." The words landed heavily. The tension was palpable now, thick enough to suffocate the room. A few customers shifted uncomfortably. One woman clutched her purse tighter, as if expecting a confrontation. The younger salesman cleared his throat nervously. Maybe we should..." "Should what?" The manager interrupted, glancing at him with a glare. "Let this guy pretend he's going to drop 100 grand on a car he can't afford? Please." The man's expression remained unchanged, but his silence spoke volumes. He let the moment stretch, watching the arrogance radiating off the manager, watching the way no one in the room dared to interfere. Then, finally, he spoke. "You seem very sure about what I can and can't afford." The manager scoffed. "I don't need to guess. I know people, and I know you don't belong here." For the first time, the man smiled, just a small, knowing curve of his lips. But it wasn't amusement. It was something else. "Interesting," he murmured. The manager let out a chuckle, shaking his head as he turned toward his staff. "See, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Guys like this come in thinking they're special, thinking they can just play dress-up and..." Before he could finish, the glass doors of the showroom swung open with force. A group of men in sharp suits entered, their presence commanding immediate attention. One of them, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a briefcase in hand, scanned the room before locking eyes with the man the manager had just humiliated. "There you are," the older man said, striding forward with urgency. "We've been waiting for you. Everything is ready. Just need your final approval before we sign." The showroom fell into a stunned silence. The manager's smirk faltered. The younger salesman's mouth parted slightly, realization dawning too late. The older man reached out, shaking the hand of the one they had just mocked. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person, sir. Congratulations on the acquisition." Acquisition. The word hung in the air like an anvil, crashing down on the manager's arrogance with unforgiving weight. The man turned his gaze back to him, watching as the reality of the situation began to settle in. The shift in power was immediate, suffocating. "You were saying?" the man asked, his voice deceptively light. The manager's throat bobbed as he struggled to find words. I think there's been a misunderstanding." A slow, deliberate nod. "Oh, I don't think there has." The room was silent, all eyes on the man who had walked in as a stranger and now stood as the one in control, the one they had underestimated. The one who had just proven, without needing to raise his voice, that power wasn't always about appearances. It was about knowing exactly when to let the truth speak for itself. The air inside the showroom felt heavier now, thick with tension and the unmistakable sting of realization. The manager, who had spent the past few minutes humiliating the man before him, stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as if he were still struggling to process the words that had just been spoken. The new owner. The same man he had dismissed. The same man he had publicly degraded. A bead of sweat formed at the manager's temple. He forced a chuckle, an awkward, nervous sound that barely masked the panic rising in his throat. I think there's been a mix-up, he stammered, glancing toward his staff, as if hoping someone would step in, offer him a way out. You're the new owner? The man, no, the boss, tilted his head slightly, studying him the way a lion studies a wounded prey. That's what the paperwork says. His voice remained calm, unreadable, but there was something sharp beneath it, something dangerous. The suited men behind him, the ones who had entered so confidently, exchanged quiet glances. One of them, the graying businessman who had greeted him earlier, adjusted his tie before stepping forward. Yes, Mr. Carter here finalized the acquisition last week, he confirmed. As of this morning, this dealership belongs to him. The words landed like a hammer. The employees in the showroom, who had been smirking and sneering moments ago, now stood eerily silent. A few of them exchanged anxious glances, their expressions betraying their sudden realization. They had just witnessed their boss insult the man who now controlled their paychecks. The younger salesman who had initially spoken to Carter swallowed hard. He had sensed something was off earlier, had tried to engage with the man rather than dismiss him. Now, he looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The manager, on the other hand, was spiraling. His mind raced, searching for a way to salvage the situation, to undo the damage. Mr. Carter, he began, forcing a wide plastic smile. Had I known? Carter held up a hand. The manager shut his mouth instantly. You didn't know, Carter said, his voice smooth, deliberate. And that's the problem, isn't it? The silence stretched uncomfortably. The weight of his words settled over the room like a storm cloud, thick with the unspoken reality. The manager had built his entire authority on assumptions, on judgment, on deciding within seconds who mattered and who didn't. And now, he was standing before a man he had misjudged in the worst possible way. Carter took a slow step forward. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't loud, but it sent a clear message. He was no longer just a man browsing a showroom. He was in charge now. Tell me, Carter continued, his voice still calm, still measured. How many customers have you turned away like this? The manager let out a strained laugh, shaking his head quickly. No, Mr. Carter. This was just a misunderstanding. I didn't mean. But you did, Carter interrupted, and this time his voice had an edge. You meant every word. The only thing that's changed is that now you realize who you were talking to. The manager's face flushed red. Sir, please, if I could just... Carter held up a single finger. The manager fell silent again. I could fire you right now, Carter said simply. The statement wasn't emotional. It wasn't angry. It was just a fact. And the manager knew it. His fingers twitched at his sides. His breathing had quickened slightly. A part of Carter enjoyed the silence, enjoyed watching the arrogance drain from the man's posture. But he wasn't here for petty revenge. That wasn't how real power worked. He turned slightly, looking around at the other employees in the room, the ones who had watched, who had laughed, who had let it happen. What about the rest of you? Carter asked, his gaze sweeping the room. You all saw what happened. No one spoke. You saw your manager insult a customer. You saw him throw someone out without even asking a single real question. And you said nothing. The younger salesman shifted uncomfortably. Sir, Carter turned toward him. His expression softened slightly. You tried, he acknowledged. That's more than I can say for the rest of them. The young man exhaled, relief flashing across his face. Carter turned back to the manager. What should I do with you? He mused. The manager swallowed hard. Sir, please, I've been here for years. I know how this dealership runs. I can be an asset. Carter raised a brow. You mean the way you just knew who I was when I walked in? The manager flinched. Carter let the silence stretch again, before finally exhaling and shaking his head. Here's what's going to happen. The manager straightened slightly, clinging to any hope. You're done here, Carter said, finality in his tone. The hope crumbled. The manager opened his mouth, but Carter didn't let him speak. You will gather your things, he continued, and you will leave. Right now. The panic was unmistakable now. Sir, please, If you make a scene, Carter warned, his voice lower now, I'll make sure every dealership within 50 miles knows exactly why you were let go. And we both know that'll make finding another job difficult. That shut him up. The color drained from the manager's face. He nodded stiffly, his jaw tight, before turning toward the back office. His steps were heavy, humiliated. The showroom was silent. Carter turned back to the remaining staff. Anyone else want to tell me how this place is supposed to be run? No one spoke. Carter smirked. That's what I thought. He turned to the suited man who had come in with him. We'll go over staffing changes later. For now, I want a full report on sales practices here. The man nodded immediately. Of course, sir. Carter exhaled, glancing around the showroom one last time before smirking. Let's see if we can actually make this place worth walking into. And just like that, the dealership had a new order. One where assumptions would no longer dictate success. One where judgment wasn't based on appearance, but on actions. And for those who couldn't adapt, well, the manager had already proven what happened to people like that. The dealership was drowning in silence. The weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air, pressing down on every employee, every customer who had witnessed the fall of the arrogant manager. No one moved. No one spoke. All eyes remained locked on the man who now stood at the center of it all. The man they had ignored, mocked, and dismissed just minutes ago. Carter exhaled slowly, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the uneasy faces around him. The ones who had laughed before were now frozen, their confidence stripped away. He could feel the shift, the unspoken panic settling into their bones as reality took hold. They had underestimated the wrong man. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps broke the silence. The former manager, now just another unemployed man, walked toward the exit with stiff, robotic movements, his face drained of color. No one dared to look at him. No one offered a word of sympathy. He had built his career on power plays, on humiliating those he deemed unworthy. But now, stripped of his title, stripped of the illusion of control, he was nothing. He reached the glass doors and hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if hoping someone, anyone, would come to his defense. No one did. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Carter let the moment stretch, absorbing the energy in the room. Then, slowly, he turned to face the remaining employees, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "You all watched that happen," he said, his voice smooth, even. "Not just today, not just with me. A few of them shifted uncomfortably. How many customers have walked in here and been treated like that? He continued, his eyes moving from one employee to the next. How many people have been ignored, insulted, or turned away because someone assumed they weren't worth the time? No one spoke. Carter tilted his head slightly. And how many sales have you lost because of it? The question landed like a punch. Some of them blinked, startled by the realization. Carter let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. This place could be making double what it is now. But instead, you've been letting arrogance decide who walks away with a car and who walks away with a bad taste in their mouth. He took a slow step forward, watching as the employees tensed under his gaze. That stops today. The younger salesman, the only one who had made an effort to treat him with respect earlier, finally spoke up. What? What does that mean for us? Carter considered him for a moment. It means I'm watching. It means the way you treat people matters. And it means if I catch any of you acting the way he did. He gestured toward the door, where the former manager had disappeared. You won't just lose a sale, you'll lose your job. A quiet murmur rippled through the staff. Some looked worried, some looked relieved. One of the senior salesmen, a man in his 50s with graying hair, cleared his throat. And if we prove we're better than that? Carter smirked. Then you'll be rewarded. He let the words hang for a moment before adding, loyalty works both ways. If you show me you care about this place, about how we treat people, you'll have nothing to worry about. But if you think you can keep running things like before, you won't last long. The older salesman nodded slowly, understanding the message loud and clear. Carter exhaled, glancing around one last time before turning to his business associate. We've got work to do. The man nodded. I'll have the first reports on your desk by morning. Carter gave him a small nod of approval, then turned toward the exit, walking toward the same doors the former manager had just walked through. But unlike that man, Carter left the room with his head held high, his authority unquestioned. The employees watched him go, knowing that things would never be the same again. The door swung shut behind Carter, but the impact of his presence lingered like an unshakable force. The employees stood frozen, still processing everything that had unfolded before them. The weight of the moment was undeniable. Power had shifted. The hierarchy they had once known was gone, and the dealership they had been so comfortable in had just changed forever. One of the senior employees, a man who had worked under the now-fired manager for years, ran a shaky hand through his thinning hair. Damn, he muttered under his breath. We really screwed up, didn't we? The younger salesman, the only one who had shown Carter an ounce of respect, exhaled deeply. Yeah, he said, voice laced with disbelief. We did. Meanwhile, outside in the parking lot, Carter stood next to his luxury sedan, the sleek black paint reflecting the setting sun. His business associate handed him a folder, thick with reports, financial summaries, and operational breakdowns. What's the plan now? The associate asked. Carter flipped through the first few pages before shutting it with a snap. His gaze lifted back to the dealership, where employees still huddled together inside, whispering amongst themselves, their expressions a mix of fear and uncertainty. We rebuild, Carter said simply, from the ground up. The associate nodded. And the staff? Carter's expression didn't change. Some will stay, some will go. Those who learn will have a future here, those who don't. He let the sentence hang, but the implication was clear. The dealership was no longer a place where arrogance dictated success. The days of judging customers based on their appearance were over. And for those who thought they could keep operating under the old rules, they would soon find themselves walking out the same door Their former manager had just been shoved through. Carter glanced back one last time, his gaze sharp, calculating. Then, without another word, he slid into his car, the engine humming to life as he pulled away, leaving behind a dealership that would never be the same again. As Carter's car disappeared down the street, the weight of what had just happened settled over the dealership like an unshakable storm. Inside, the employees stood in uneasy silence, exchanging glances filled with uncertainty, realization, and, for some, a newfound respect. The air was different now. The rules had changed. The younger salesman, still processing it all, let out a slow breath. "I don't think this place will ever be the same again." The older salesman beside him chuckled, shaking his head. "No," he admitted, "and that might not be a bad thing." Outside, the former manager stood near his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned white. His mind raced, replaying every word, every decision, every smug dismissal. He had built his career on assumptions, on deciding who mattered before they even spoke. And in the end, that arrogance had cost him everything. Carter, meanwhile, drove on, his expression calm, unreadable. This wasn't about revenge. It was about setting a new standard, about proving that power didn't come from appearances, but from actions. And those who underestimated the wrong people, they would always learn the hard way. And now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been judged unfairly, only to prove everyone wrong? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful lessons like this one. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't getting even, it's showing them who you really are.